Mr. David Shinn, with all your respect, thank you very much for your accepting us to be a guest in our program today.
Happy to join you, Boris.
Yeah, thank you. And we will try to, since you are a seasoned ambassador and also an academician, we will see how we can enlighten our audience who are listening, especially what's going on in Horn of Africa. To begin, I would like to ask you this question. Let us look the state formation and the nation while we are grounding in the context of universalized nation states that Africa or in general all the other countries inherited from the Weberian style that has been in question in the last, especially after the unipolar is changing to multipolar and then unipolar, all this kind of jargon that is very hard to understand. Can you, shed light on those areas?
Well, I think you have a situation where much of the Horn of Africa in the last several years, particularly, has been going backwards politically, and the strength of the institutions has been called into question in many cases. This situation has been ongoing in Somalia for a longer period of time, perhaps, than in Ethiopia or in Sudan, which have been very troubled in the last couple of years. But it really does call into question the ability of the states in the region to maintain themselves as viable states. I would say this is particularly true in the case of Sudan, where there are actual allegations or suggestions that the state has already collapsed. I would not go that far, but there are experts in the region who do claim that state collapse has taken place in Sudan. But clearly the institutions are weakened throughout, and this is unfortunate because you really need strong governmental institutions to maintain a nation state. And if this doesn't continue, then you're going to face real problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you put it nicely here, I would like to quote one of the leading sociologists or anthropologists, if I'm not mistaken, Max Weber, who defined the modern state as a community that successfully claims a monopoly over violence within a geographical area, which require is to have a legitimate and legal authority. So, as one of late in Dr. Somali, well known in Said Samatar, put it, he was arguing always within the scholars and people like you, academician, that Africa is a nation, but is in search of state. And what we inherited, from the Western still doesn't, take into consideration the reality on the ground. What's your take on that?
Well, there's, I think, an element of truth to that. I think it's very difficult, however, to generalize about 54 different nation states in Africa. Some have actually held up rather well. Their boundaries have not been seriously questioned, and they have maintained a relatively democratic regime or government since independence. Others have not. Others have been troubled pretty much since the beginning. I think in part this is a legacy of borders that were poorly drawn or poorly conceived at one time. In some cases, it's just the luck of the draw in terms of ethnic makeup of particular parts of the continent, some parts being luckier than others in terms of how the borders were drawn, and therefore the constitutional makeup of a country today. But it is you literally have to look at it, I think, country by country or region by region. Unfortunately, the Horn of Africa has been more troubled than most regions. If you compare, for example, the Horn with Southern Africa, Southern Africa has proportionally done a great deal better.
Yes.
there have been parts of Central Africa that have been very troubled, pretty much from the beginning. I would say that Central Africa and the Horn of Africa have been the most troubled parts of the continent.
Yeah, as you put it again nicely, I was trying to compare other African region like the South, West, and the North. It seems like although they are not stable, but still there is a lot of, comparing to those regions. Horn of Africa, I couldn't figure out throughout my life. Always there is a conflict, and some even authors they're saying the Horn of Africa has been a laboratory for international political orders since the 19th century, testing the bound of possible, as you say, territorial and sovereignty dispensation. So even right now, when I see in diaspora or even in Ethiopia right now, there are always early last time, previous on our interviews also you answered these questions. These two school of thoughts are always fighting, namely Unitarian, those who are, articulating that concept, and also the other group who are always saying Ethiopia is like Walali Mokon, Ethiopia is a prisoners of nation and nationality. What is the way out of this, and how we can, manage this conflict in order to come on the middle and try to solve this problem?
Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer for how to solve it. I think you make a very valid point that the legacy of conflict in the Horn of Africa is a very long one, including in Ethiopia, which has the longest history of independence in the region. It's true, it has been independent, but during that period of independence, there are significant periods of internal conflict in the country. So conflict is nothing new to Ethiopia or to the other countries that have a more recent history of independence. I think that if I had to try to provide any answer at all for how do you deal with it, it is to build stronger institutions, a point I made at the outset. And if you have strong institutions, they can weather a lot of the conflict in a country, and they can overcome ethnic differences, at least theoretically. Unfortunately, that has too often not happened in this part of Africa, and clearly much more has to be done in order to strengthen the institutions. But I don't think that further division of countries is the answer. There are some that would argue that that should happen in a place like Ethiopia. I'm not at all convinced that that's the answer. I think that Ethiopia can be a unified state, albeit with constant challenges, without dividing up. And I think the same is frankly true for Sudan. There are now some who are arguing that it's necessary to divide Sudan into different parts. I don't think history has shown that that has solved very many problems.
As you were one time even ambassador of U.S. in Ethiopia, since you know well, you know that area very well. As you know, during Haile Selassie, used to be a federal system that always, one group, like Haile Selassie group, they say they were oppressing the rest of Ethiopia. And then in 60s, all these different group, they took arm and it was Liberation Front, Somali Liberation Front, Gambela, blah, blah, all that. And then we move on to the Derg, and Derg was a socialist country that, although they don't even know the ABC of the socialism and what it takes, what kind of resource. And then third, the Mellis group come, and then they try to put it in the constitution, this article that is really, really always in some group, especially people from the north side, they say it is a problem. The source of the problem of Ethiopia is ethnic politics. And on the other hand, the other group, you're saying, no, national nationality Ethiopia, it has to be like a preamble of the constitution. What is what kind of, as you want that Ethiopia be a unity country, which is everybody agree with you, but what will be the solution that these two, as I said earlier, also reconcile and work together and live together and manage this conflict.
Well, you just said that everyone wants Ethiopia to be a unified country. I think there are some in Ethiopia who would disagree with that and who would make the argument that they would like to divide the country up. I think they're a minority, but nevertheless, there are elements who make that argument. I disagree with that group. I think Ethiopia ought to remain a unified country. Now, Ethiopia has a long history of authoritarianism also. There are people who will disagree with me on that, but I think it's a fact. It is most of Ethiopia's rule historically has been of an authoritarian nature, and that has continued pretty much up to the present time. You probably can make the case that there has to be an element of authoritarianism in Ethiopia in order to hold the place together. That sometimes runs contrary to the views of Democrats or even Americans who want to see a democratic country and freedom of speech and free and fair elections, independent judiciary, all of those kinds of things that tend to be divisive. But this is the conflict that Eritrea, or that rather Ethiopia, faces today, whether it is going to be continue to be authoritarian or whether it is going to be more democratic. And it probably has to be a mix of the two. But trying to achieve that balance is what is so hard to do. And clearly the country has not fully succeeded in doing that yet, nor have other countries in the region.
Yeah, the young, the 1960s and 70s student of Ethiopia, they used to be them. What do you call it? Marxist, Leninist, whatever we call them. So always there were, especially the people who we consider very, group. The reason I'm talking about that, I want to define that, concept, and then try to apply what's currently is going on in Tigray. Here they were saying a nation is historically constituted stable community of population formed on the basis of common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifest in a common culture. It goes without saying that a nation, like every historical phenomenon, is subject to the law of change, has its history, its beginning and end. So today, this week, Getachew Reda, they have had in Denver, they have had a meeting there, and he talked about still, after all those, as you follow closely the war, and then the signing up in South Africa and all that, the peace agreement and all that. He's saying still we are opted for, I don't know if he wanted to just play, in the minds of diaspora, but he was saying that we are opted still to articulate this line of self-determination. So in your perspective, what will be the next step for Tigray? Is it a federalist project, confederation, or conglomeration of many states or independent Tigray?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not in a position to judge what majority opinion is in Tigray. Yes. You would have to be on the ground in Tigray and talking with many Tigrayans to judge that. My impression is, and it's a very narrow impression based on the number of persons I'm able to be in contact with, is that still a majority of Tigrayans would prefer to be part of a national Ethiopian government. Maybe I'm wrong in that judgment, but that's my impression. But there clearly is a strong minority that would opt for some kind of separate state, either independent state or one that's largely autonomous. But what that breakdown is in terms of numbers of people, I just don't know. I think it's important to continue to work towards national unity, including national unity to include Tigray. But there are those who will disagree with that. But this is the challenge of Ethiopia today, and not just in Tigray, but certain other parts of the country too. The Somalis have occasionally had the same argument, or at least some of them have. And perhaps that's true in the Gambella area. I'm not really in touch with what's going on there today, but I think that there are various parts of the country that have had this discussion, and it's up to the people of Ethiopia to make that ultimate decision. But it's important that the government of Ethiopia work to make those decisions that keep all of these different units desirous of being part of a united Ethiopia.
Mhm. So when you look at it right now, what's going on in Amara region? There is Fano is still fighting with the government. As I said earlier, 2 years of war in Tigray, which is take back almost 4 years of their, development and all that. Again, as I say earlier, there was also fighting going on in Gambela, different region of Ethiopia. And what will be, the role of Ethiopian intellectual here, who are especially the diaspora, who are playing a lot of, has a lot of influence. But it seems like when I see even their different media, every group, every ethnic group, they are locked in their just a closet, and they don't have any dialogue, I see. And every group has just having their conference. This week the Tigrayans have in Denver, the other group were having in Washington DC, here in Minnesota the Oromos has with the different groups, the Somalis has. What is, how we can break this cycle to come out and then sit down and talk about it. Even, you see, forget about the rest, even the religion within Christian, today they divided in three major segments. Look what's happening in Tigray. They nominated their own, the Oromos, they were fighting with Amara. You are a person who have been following Ethiopia and know very well what will be, how we can break this cycle so that the intellectual, especially, the elites will talk.
Well, I may say a few things here that will alienate parts of the Ethiopian diaspora, but I think they perhaps need to be said. First, my experience with the diaspora in the United States, and there are Ethiopian diasporas throughout much of Europe and Australia, and even to some extent in places as far afield as Latin America, although they're very small there. That the diaspora is important in terms of intellectual thought and discussion. Outside of Ethiopia, I'm not sure how much impact it has inside Ethiopia, which is what really counts. It's the people who are still living inside Ethiopia that are truly the important ones. Now, where the diaspora comes into play in a more tangible way is in the area of funding. It can provide money for different groups inside Ethiopia, and therefore it can have a sort of indirect impact upon what's happening there. The diaspora can also do some very useful things like providing medical assistance to Ethiopians, or helping develop education, or investing in the country in the private business sector. So it can be a very positive force in that regard. But I really have to question how much impact the Ethiopian diaspora, wherever it may be located outside of Ethiopia, has on the actual politics of Ethiopia. How much do the elected leaders of Ethiopia pay to the diaspora? And you may have a better answer to that than I do. But my impression is that it is often overstated, and that I'm just not convinced that what the intellectuals are saying outside of the country necessarily has that much impact upon what is happening inside Ethiopia.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you more or less. But people like Johar, they were making an impact. Like within how they come up with the social media, they use it, and then they created some kind of demonstration they were following. Right now, even within the Amhara group, if you look at it, like Dawit Georgis, who has had a lot of conflict. He worked in Rwanda, Burundi, all that area. Right now, he's a chairman for this Amara, whatever, front. And, the list will go on. But let's come back to the, with our respect, I mean, or time now. If we come back and try to ground it or frame it, the notion of U.S. policy in Horn of Africa versus, the Chinese, the other group, let us say, in Russians. I would like to take you back historically, how the U.S. policy was developed. Although you know more than better than anybody. I mean, if you are in a position here they say U.S. policy in the Horn of Africa during the 1970s was marked by the constraint posed by the international environment. The two-pillar policy formulated by the Nixon administration and later by the Ford administration was continued by the Carter administration. However, Carter major policy shifted in 1979 to 80 was not because of the Soviet support for Ethiopia or the Somali, abrogation of the treaty with the Soviet. The U.S. tended to misunderstand indigenous, here is the key for me, indigenous political change in the Middle East and in the Horn of Africa. So this area in Horn of Africa, which is all where they connected each other, Asia, the Arabs and Africa. And what will be today what do you think the policy of the U.S. in order to compete, and protect its interest in Horn of Africa?
Sure, I'll come back to that question. I just wanted to say very quickly that you made a very good point in terms of
Thank you.
The impact of the diaspora when you talk about a person like Jowar,
Yes.
who did have while he was in Minneapolis, an important impact upon developments inside Ethiopia. Of course, he went back to Ethiopia and had an even greater impact once he was inside Ethiopia. But there are those, I think, exceptions to the rule who do have a significant impact, even though they're outside. In terms of your question about U.S. policy, both historically and up to the present, although I'm probably overgeneralizing, I would argue that throughout the Cold War, that is up until roughly 1990, 1989, 1990, the United States policy towards the region was pretty much dictated by Cold War politics. And in the case of Ethiopia, particularly by Cagnu Communications Station, which is located in Asmara, but of course at that time Asmara, Eritrea, was part of Ethiopia. I can't emphasize too much how that impacted U.S. policy towards Ethiopia, U.S. arms assistance to the Haile Selassie government. I was the assistant desk officer for Ethiopia back in the late 1960s, for example, and in the period when Haile Selassie was still in power. And Cagnu sort of dictated everything in terms of our relationship with Ethiopia, because Cagnu was such an important part of Cold War politics vis-a-vis particularly the Soviet Union at the time. Now, I may be overstating it slightly, but not by a lot. I think you have to take into account what the United States was concerned about up until 1989 and 90. The relationship between the United States and Ethiopia on the one hand and the United States and Somalia on the other was also dictated by Cold War politics. I mean, we literally changed our affiliation, our alliance from Ethiopia to Somalia because of the Derg regime and its affinity for the Soviet Union. So all of a sudden, we became friendly with Somalia and had a very poor relationship with Ethiopia. Now that changed again when the EPRDF came to power and in the early 1990s, but that determined U.S. policy at the time. You bring it up to the present, and it's a more muddled picture. It's not clear cut anymore. The one thing the Cold War did was to make U.S. policy in the region pretty clear cut. Now it's confused by the fact that we want to see democratization on the one hand throughout the region. We want to see free and fair elections, independent judiciary, all that sort of thing. But we also want to see political stability. And sometimes we're finding that the desire for democratization does not coincide with political stability. So some of our decisions tend to look a bit hypocritical, where we might support authoritarian kinds of decisions in parts of the region. It really has been a less clear, I think, U.S. government policy throughout the region. We see this in the case of Sudan. We're sort of going back and forth between one trying to bring peace between the Sudan armed forces on the one hand and the rapid support forces on the other, both of which are authoritarian, both of which want to control Sudan because that would bring stability. But at the same time, we want democracy in Sudan and we want a civilian government. So we're in kind of a difficult, the U.S. is in kind of a difficult position right now in terms of how it threads the needle between pursuing its goal of avoiding human rights abuses, instituting democracy and good governance, but at the same time having political stability, because they don't all necessarily go hand in hand.
But you already answered a lot of questions I was trying to ask you. But just let us compare a little bit. The Chinese approach, and then Russia, Chinese on the one hand, which is what we consider as a BRICS. There are also India, South Africa, and all those countries. As a result of the war that is going on in Europe, Ukraine, a lot of things, the world, what used to be called the world order is shaking right now. So right now, there is a rapprochement between Russia and in Eritrea. They want to, use it in naval there. As you know, Djibouti, the tiny Djibouti, has more than 7 different military there. So, but on the other hand, when you look the economic, development, how they put in depth, all African countries, especially, what's going on right now in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, how much they own, to Chinese, because their hand is tight now. So, and the U.S. is always focusing all those elements that you enumerated, like stability, democracy, institution building. But the people are starving, and as you know, after this COVID-19, one COVID-19 was bad, and then there is a drought, there is a famine, there is a conflict, there is all this. Ethiopian people right now are on the hell, hell on earth. That's what the people are saying, because they will go to everybody who can help them. So how we can reconcile these two different approach, these two different paradigms that this superpower are trying to compete on Horn of Africa?
Well, you mentioned the role of China and Russia in the region, and that is yet one more factor which is confusing U.S. policy in the region, in that the U.S. is trying to deal with responding to what those two countries in particular are doing. And I'm not sure that the U.S. is always getting it right in terms of the response. I think that in some ways, China and Russia are working together. In other ways, they're really not. They're following different approaches to not just the Horn of Africa, but to Africa as a whole. So I would be a little careful in merging their two efforts because they're not always the same. But in the case of China, which is by far the more important player in Africa today as compared to Russia, China, I think, would like to end the period when the West, led by the United States, has in effect dictated the international rules of conduct, going back to the Bretton Woods agreements, the international financial institutions, the way that the UN has traditionally operated. And China's not happy with that. They want to change that to the point where they are in a stronger position to determine the rules. Now, they're not trying to eliminate the UN. They're not trying to eliminate the IMF or the World Bank. In fact, they're an important part of all of those organizations. But the Chinese see themselves as the leader of the global South, which constitutes an enormous number of countries, including all of those in Africa, 54 in Africa. And China sees itself as the natural leader of these countries, and it wants to, I think, lead by, in effect, using the United Nations and using the concept of globalization and emphasizing its leadership, what it sees as its leadership of the global South, to change the international rules of conduct that the West has put in place since the end of World War II. And that's where the conflict comes today between the U.S. and China. The situation with Russia is different in that Russia probably supports what I just said in terms of China, but Russia's approach to it tactically in Africa has been rather different by using the Wagner Group, for example, in places like Sudan, Mali, and the Central African Republic. I really doubt that China much appreciates groups like the Wagner Group. I doubt that they see that as a useful tool in Africa today. Yet Russia sees it as a way to gain influence on the continent because Russia is doing so little when it comes to trade, investment, and aid on the continent. And Russia's a very small player in those areas. China's a big player. So you have some areas where China and Russia are cooperating in terms of how they see the continent. And you have other areas where I think they probably see things differently. And the United States is trying to sort through all of this and deal with each country, both China and Russia, as it moves forward. Sometimes I think it does well, sometimes not so well. The one area where the United States has consistently been helpful to Africa, you mentioned the issue of humanitarian assistance and droughts and response to these humanitarian problems. The United States has always been the first with the most when it comes to humanitarian assistance throughout Africa, and particularly in the Horn of Africa, and that continues to be the case. And I think it's a very important role played by the U.S. and a very good role that the U.S. has played.
Dr. David, yesterday, Mike Hammer, the special envoy, has had a meeting in San Diego University on conflict management, and he called from different segments of mostly the activists in diaspora. The reason I'm mentioning that is in diaspora, when you look at it, the Ethiopian, the Somalis, the Eritreans on different segments, the only place they can only transfer, technology, they can transfer, knowledge, they can transfer, even money to their population out there in the Horn of Africa is from the US. There is I've never heard a single money or diaspora coming from Russia, from China, from India, from all these breaks, that they're talking about. Why the US does not, take this into consideration? This all people that they bring here, and this human capital, mostly intellectuals or the business, and try to create some kind of bridge between the Horn of Africa and the US, especially. The Europe also is the same, actually.
Well, you make a very good point. And I think to some extent, the Biden administration is trying to do something like that, maybe not exactly like you spell out. But the very meeting that you cite, which frankly I was not familiar with Mike Hammer in San Diego, is, I think, an indication of this outreach to the African diaspora. The Biden administration made very clear at the U.S. Africa Summit last fall that it wanted to have far more engagement with the diaspora. I'm not sure what all they have done with it. I'm not sure if they have any institutions in mind that they want to set up, but perhaps they do. And I think it is an important initiative by the Biden administration to pursue that, and I hope they pursue it more vigorously. You make a very interesting point that I had frankly not thought about, that these remittances, the skill transfer is coming predominantly from the United States. I think you're getting some from Europe also.
Yes.
And I know you're getting some remittances coming from places like Europe and Australia. just sheer money transfers. Now, whether you're getting any remittances from places like China or Russia, I don't know. You suggested that they're not happening. I don't know. But clearly, if they are happening, they're pretty minor compared to what is coming from places like the United States. And there are countries like Ethiopia and Somalia receive a significant part of their, and Eritrea also, a significant part of their GNP in the form of international remittances, much of which comes from the United States.
Yeah, my last question, Dr. David, is as I say earlier, also the elites, although you say they cannot play, a major a role, I mean, to more or less on what's happening on the ground. What kind of, alternative or way outs will be for this crisis that is going on right now in Ethiopia with these all different groups, as I said earlier, locked in themselves? And also what's happening right now, even in Somalia, Somaliland, all those countries in Sudan. I mean, this is a lot of things to talk about. But just to summarize, individually, what will be the solution? And then in the diaspora, for me, the focus is on the diaspora. What kind of role they can play to bring peace, lasting peace, and people can move on to economic, prosperity and have a life.
Well, again, I'm not going to have an answer that's going to be totally satisfactory, but there's one area that one could start with, and I think is a very important area, and one that certainly is applicable to Ethiopia, is if everyone in the diaspora would absolutely ban hate speech. It is absolutely horrible development, and particularly in recent years. It seems to have died down a bit at the moment, but there was a period in Ethiopia recently where the hate speech on the social media was just atrocious. And that does not help anyone anyhow. No one should be permitted to engage in that, and everyone should be called out who does engage in it. Going beyond the banning of hate speech would be if all elements of the diaspora would just try to think of themselves in a more neutral way rather than as an ethnic group, and try to see themselves for the good of a country or a wider region rather than a particular ethnic group. Now, that's very hard to do, I understand. It's hard for Americans to do. I mean, we all come from somewhere else too, and think of ourselves sometimes as part of a particular group. But the more one can try to isolate that element of their being, of their existence, I think can have a long-term positive benefit for their countries in Africa.
Thank you so much for your time and for coming with this short notice, Mr. David Shinn.
Thank you, Gars.
Thank you.